Welcome back. We're here in Matthew 27. I hope you have your Bible before you as we go through it today, because today's an important one. We left off the story seeing Jesus be arrested and on trial before the Jewish government, and now we see that he's before the Romans. And this is the story that will lead us to Jesus' crucifixion today. So we really want to enter into this time together, just aware of the gravity of this story. We're going to talk about some important things and just see what God has for us, what we can learn from this very important story. So we'll pick back up. We're at the beginning of chapter 27 in verse 1, where we see the Roman trial. Is there anything you'd like to add as we sort of jump back in here?
Yeah, well, you did a good job setting up the transition here. At the end of chapter 26, we had the trial in front of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, the priests, the Pharisees, elders, and they want to put Jesus to death but don't have the authority to do it since they're under Roman rule. And now, the chapter we're studying today shifts to the second trial, which is in front of Roman authorities, and that is going to eventually lead to his death, even though the original impetus came from the Jewish leaders. So, it says when morning came, they bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to the Roman governor Pilate. That's an interesting phrase, when morning came, because what that suggests is that the Jewish trial that we studied in our last lesson took place before dawn, before morning dawned. And if so, that was illegal, even according to the Sanhedrin's own laws. They were not allowed to meet and to conduct legal business at that time. So they're so desperate to condemn Jesus that they acted kind of against their own principles to do that. So now here we are off to Pilate. He's bound. I think I forgot to mention during the last lesson that at the end of the Jewish trial, Jesus was physically abused and mistreated by the temple police. It says he was struck, he was spat upon, he was slapped, he was mocked. So Jesus has already been seriously, physically and emotionally abused. And unfortunately, that abuse is just going to get worse under the Romans. Yeah. But this guy Pilate, maybe we should
tell us a little bit about the historical context. Who is Pilate?
Yeah. Pilate's his last name, Pilatus in Latin, and Pontius is his first name, so Pontius Pilatus. He was the Roman governor of Judea, which was really a very small province. It wasn't even all of Israel, because it did not include Galilee, up north where Jesus was from, or Samaria. It just was that southern part called Judea. It was a very rebellious province, and so it was under the direct control of the emperor, who appointed a governor to go there. Some people will see in their Bibles the word procurator, which was the actual Roman term for what kind of governor he was. And we know his exact dates, AD 26 to 36. So the death of Jesus took place in about AD 30. That would have come right in the center of his reign as governor there. The Emperor Tiberius had appointed him. We know that. His capital, the Roman capital, was not Jerusalem. It was a coastal city that had been built by King Herod decades before called Caesarea, named in honor of Caesar, Caesarea. And it was called Caesarea Maritima, meaning by the sea, because it was a seaport. Pontius Pilate was a terrible governor, not just because he ordered Jesus' death, but all the way through. He made very bad mistakes. He was forever being insensitive to the Jewish people that he was supposed to rule over, and just exacerbating the tension between Jews and Rome. Like once he told his soldiers to go in and occupy a fortress near the temple area, and around the parapet above the temple courtyards, he told them to hang their shields as a show of, Roman power. The trouble is, Roman shields had the embossed image of the emperor on it. So here they are hanging graven images right above the temple of the Jews. And he was clueless to this. The priest went to him and said, whoa, this is a no-no. This is our first law. This is 10 Commandments stuff here. No graven images. And so he did have them take it down. But that's just the kind of clueless stuff that he did. Yeah.
Okay.
So he was bad news. It appears that at the end, he was finally fired from his job and sent off into exile just because he was such a lousy governor.
He was so bad at it.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So there's a little bit about Pontius Pilate.
That's very helpful. Yeah.
Okay.
So then we'll go ahead on to verses 3 through 10. We see the death of Judas. So that Judas saw Jesus was condemned. He repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. And I just find this fascinating, thinking of, as you read on, you see that he admits that he sins, and that the chief priests and elders say, what is that to us? And to think of, these are the people who are supposed to be ready to help someone repent or sacrifice or, see what they need to do because they sinned, and they don't really care because they got what they wanted. They got Jesus condemned, and that they don't really want to help Judas in any way. So what do you notice about this?
Well, that's a fascinating point. You put that in a way I don't think I'd ever quite thought before, that the Jewish religious leaders have had their minds so taken over by political opposition to Jesus that they are forfeiting their spiritual role as the priests of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And you're right, they're insensitive to his repentance, they're insensitive to his confession, and in a sense, drive him to suicide.
Yeah, they care about the fact that the money is blood money. So they're like kind of particular about certain things, but they don't care about anything else.
I wish we got more insight into Judas's motives from this passage, but we don't.
Yeah,
we've
really
already talked about. At least I am uncertain of his motives, and he does recognize that he has betrayed innocent blood. Jesus is definitely not guilty of the crimes he's being charged for. So he recognizes that. And it says he repented, but the word repented has quite a range of meanings. It can mean a really deep spiritual regret and resolve to change and follow the will of God. Or it can just mean changed his mind.
Okay.
And so it's a little hard to know.
Yeah. It's a big range.
So we're left at the death of Judas with just as many questions as we had before of his motives.
Yeah, I still find myself wondering, is this not what he thought would happen? Or did he think something else would happen to Jesus? I don't know. And those are things we just won't be able to know.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we continue on. Now we're in verse 11, and then we're seeing Jesus before the governor. That's Pilate, right? So seeing a little bit of this exchange here. And then some stuff with Barabbas as well. So a lot to unpack here. As you look at this, what jumps out to you?
Well, the first thing that I notice is that the charges against Jesus have changed.
Okay.
Yeah, the prosecutors have pulled a fast one here. When they brought Jesus before the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, the charges were that he had claimed to be the Messiah and the Son of God and was talking about messing with the temple. Well, those are religious charges. And that would have appealed to the religious leaders like priests and scribes and elders. But now that he's standing before a Roman governor, the charge has completely changed, and he's being accused of claiming to be the king of the Jews, which is a very, very different thing. And the reason why that would have been the way to push the button of the Roman governor is that Rome, which ruled Judea now, claimed the full right to naming the king of the Jews. Rome had named Herod king of the Jews and parceled out his kingdom to various ones of his sons. So to say that somebody just claimed the role of king of the Jews would be claiming that they were flaunting Roman authority. So that's a big change and something worth noticing there, Pilate takes the initiative to question the accused, and says, don't you hear all these accusations against you? And Jesus responds pretty much the same way as he did in the first trial, with silence. So Jesus doesn't, not only did Jesus reject the physical defense that we saw in the garden with the pulling of the sword, he even rejects verbal self-defense.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. Don't you find it interesting that Pilate I shouldn't say kind of. I think Pilate thinks Jesus is innocent of the charges brought against him.
That's what it
Don't
seems
you?
like. Yeah, even it almost seems like he's bargaining a little bit with, don't you guys want Barabbas? You can tell, at least from the way it's written, that it seems like he's wrestling a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. He really, I think, wants Jesus to defend himself. And then it says he's greatly amazed that Jesus won't defend himself. And then, who do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who's called the Messiah? This Barabbas guy was a true revolutionary. I mean, he had been convicted of trying to overthrow the Roman government.
Okay.
And Jesus has been an itinerant teacher, rabbi. He hasn't led any
He hasn't tried that at all. Yeah.
armed insurrections. And I think Pilate just assumes that Barabbas is the real nasty criminal here. Jesus, whoever he's offended, is certainly not worthy of crucifixion. So he's shocked first at Jesus' lack of self-defense, and then he's shocked that the Jewish people want Barabbas released instead of Jesus. So he's really clueless. Pilate also suspects that the Jews don't have a legal leg to stand on here, that they're acting out of jealousy. And that's in verse 18. He realized that it was out of jealousy that they handed him over. So Pilate questions the motives of the Jewish religious leaders. There is another way in which he kind of tries to backpedal and maybe get Jesus off the hook. And then his wife gets in on the act. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that feels like an odd little detail. Have nothing to do with that innocent man. Yeah, she talks about having a dream about him.
Yeah. I don't know what to make of that little story. We've been reading the Gospels, and even in Matthew itself, which we're studying here, back in the opening chapters, dreams were sent by God to Joseph and later to the Magi. Yeah. So we think of the word dream, and we think of the Old Testament like Joseph. We think of dreams as something kind of God revealed. I don't know if that's what's going on here or not. We just don't know, do we? But eventually, Pilate decides he's got to give in. And I think there are a couple of reasons why he would have decided that. One is stated in the text. It says in verse 24, he could do nothing but rather that a riot was beginning. And Roman government officials feared nothing worse than chaos. They loved control. We've still got a phrase that we use sometimes, the Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. That didn't really mean peace in the high-minded way in which we use the word. What it meant was the lid is kept on everything under control. And so the last thing he wants is a riot. And he senses that if he doesn't hand Jesus over to be executed, there's going to be a popular uprising. The thing that's not stated in the text is what I mentioned earlier. Pilate knows that he has already thoughtlessly infuriated the Jewish religious leaders over and over again. And he senses that if he doesn't play ball with them in this, that it might lead to further trouble. So at any rate, we have this washing of the hands. That's become an expression in our culture, hasn't it? Kind of, I wash my hands of that.
Separate yourself away from it.
So that's the story of Pilate.
All right.
Handed him over to be crucified.
Okay.
And then the abuse continues, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah, I know. This is pretty extreme as you look at it, that they stripped him, they put a scarlet robe around him, that's where the crown of thorns is put on his head, a reed in his hand, kind of like he's ruling over them, but in a mock way. That feels like the worst part, just kind of how mocking it is, that they're, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him, and then they led him away to crucify him. So anything about that really jumps out to you?
Yeah, a couple things. One is Pilate had already ordered him to be flogged even before the soldiers got in on this mockery thing here. And the flogging is mentioned up in verse 26. After flogging Jesus, he handed him over, that is, handed him over to the soldiers, Roman soldiers, to be crucified. And I'm sure people know that flogging was a punishment that often led to death in and of itself.
It's pretty extreme already.
Yeah. It didn't get to, I don't think we need to describe all the details of Roman flogging, but it was a terrible punishment physically that often led to death. So there's the flogging, and then there's all this mockery. And it's interesting, what they're mocking is his claim to be King of the Jews. So royal robe, crown, scepter, all these are marks of a king. And so they're making fun of the fact that anybody would have thought Jesus was the King of the Jews. There is a record of the fact that Roman soldiers sometimes would play games, a terrible, taunting game with slaves, kind of king for the day thing, where they would treat a slave like a king, like a lord, all day, and give him whatever food he wanted and have him all dressed up like a king and everything like that, and at the end of the day kill him.
Wow.
There's some evidence that that sadistic Roman soldiers played that game.
Wow.
And it could be that
It's sort of
there's
there's
a kind of a parallel overlap with that. But at any rate, the physical and emotional abuse continues, sure enough.
I find it interesting what you just said about how the flogging in itself could kill someone. That leads us really well into the next section, where we see that a man named Simon had to carry Jesus's cross. And part of the reason for that was because they wanted the victims to be alive when they were crucified. So this shows that Jesus was probably really weak, but they wanted him to be alive enough to be even tortured more when he was crucified. So I just find that really interesting to think through what a state he already was in. But also to recognize, that image of carrying Jesus's cross. We see so much already throughout the Bible, throughout Matthew, where leading up to this, every image of carrying a cross was what he was telling his disciples to do. Pick up your cross and follow me. And there are no disciples to be seen. There's just this guy named Simon, who I don't think we really know much about him, do we?
We don't. There is a possibility that he was a follower of Jesus, and that's why he's kind of close there. But you would think if Matthew knew him to be a follower of Jesus, he would have called him a disciple.
That makes sense, yeah.
And he doesn't, so I think he is a bystander.
Okay.
Yeah. And so your point really stands well, that the irony here is that the people that Jesus had called on to carry the cross in faithfulness to him are nowhere to be seen, and some relative stranger from the crowd has to. Yeah, we don't know who Simon is. Simon, as we mentioned earlier, it was a very, very popular name for Jewish people. We met Simon the leper last lesson, and so he very likely was a Jewish man. But he's from North Africa. Does that mean he's an African, not a Jew? No, not necessarily, because thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Jewish people had migrated to North Africa.
Okay.
And that's where Cyrene is. It's what we now call Libya. And so it's not at all surprising that a ethnic Jew was living and working in North Africa. It is possible, on the other hand, that he is an African man, a Gentile, who has become a worshiper of God and has taken on a Jewish name. So again, we've got more questions than answers
lots of possibilities
about this. But I think your original point is probably the best one here, that Jesus is already so physically on the edge of death that he simply could not carry his cross unassisted. Yeah, good point.
We see a lot of other things as well in this passage as we go on from that. It says when they come to the place of Golgotha, is that how you say it?
Yeah. And it Matthew fortunately translates this for us here. Golgotha was a Hebrew word or an Aramaic word that meant place of a skull. Some people might think, I thought Jesus was crucified on Calvary. Well, Calvary is the Latin word for skull. Okay. Golgotha is the Hebrew word for skull. So it's it's the same word. It's Skull Hill in either language, in both languages. So yeah, that's what Golgotha is.
And then they offered him wine to drink, and he wouldn't drink it.
Yeah, that wine was probably something to kind of revive him.
Okay.
And to keep him alive, like you were talking about earlier, or maybe as a slight narcotic. So that he didn't feel the pain quite so much, but Jesus has nothing to do with it.
Okay. And then they crucify him and they divide his clothes among them by casting lots. Anything you want to say about that?
Well, one thing, casting of lots was very, very common in the ancient world. Even Jews did it. There are references in the Old Testament to doing it. There's a reference in the book of Acts to choosing an apostle by casting lots. Lots were dice, often made of bones. So that was a very common thing. But the other thing, the more interesting thing to me about the casting of lots is that was prophesied in Psalm 22.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, a messianic psalm.
Okay.
So that's what strikes me as really important
really
there. Yeah.
Okay. And we go on and we just continue to get more and more details about the crucifixion. They write, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." We see that people are crucified with him. A lot of details in here. So what do you kind of pull out as you take a look at that part?
Yeah, well, the sign, which was either hung around the criminal's neck on a rope or affixed to the cross, was to name the crime for which he was being executed. And that was thought to be some kind of a warning to bystanders. So you don't want to do that crime because look where you'll end up.
Wow.
So it states his crime. So King of the Jews is his crime, or claiming to be King of the Jews. And that was the thing that would have pushed the button of Romans, right, as we discussed. I don't know if people have noticed this in Christian art of the crucifixion or sculpture sometimes. I know in the church I grew up in, there was a metal cross, handsome cross on the communion table. And right in the middle where the crossbars crossed were the letters I-N-R-I. And you've seen that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if our viewers have ever noticed that or not. That's what those initials are.
Okay.
I is Jesus, N, Nazarene of Nazareth. R is the Latin Rex for king, and then the I is of the Jews.
Okay.
So I-N-R-I, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This is a version of that, King of the Jews. So, that's his crime.
Okay.
Then you also mentioned the people who were crucified with him. Yeah. Many English translations use the word thief for them, the thieves on the cross, right? That's not a very helpful translation, because to me, a thief could be like a sneak thief, somebody who robs some jewelry and sneaks out the back door. This is a different word than that. It means a brigand, a rebel. And it would have been appropriate to describe some of those zealot warriors who were trying to overthrow the Roman government and would break into Roman army camps and steal weapons and things like that. These guys aren't just sneak thieves. They're revolutionaries. So the ironic thing is that Jesus is being crucified with people who actually had been trying to militarily overthrow the Roman government.
Wow. Yeah.
Something that Jesus
He's accused of.
has been accused of, as it were. Yeah. So that's who's with him there on the cross.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that do they join in with the mockery as well? I'm trying to remember if that's in the Matthew or in a different gospel, but that we see. Well, it does talk about other people walking by.
Yeah, it doesn't talk about their mockery here,
okay.
but you're right. Other gospels, do mention that. Yeah.
Okay.
But there were two groups who were mocking Jesus on the cross, and one is the general populace, the passersby. Let's see what they're saying. You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.
Yeah.
So they're making fun of Jesus' inability, as it were, weakness, lack of power to defy the Romans and their efforts to crucify him.
Yeah. And then I see verse 44 is where it says the rebels who were crucified with him also taunted him. So, it does say it in Matthew.
Where does it say that?
Verse 44. So right at the bottom.
Oh, down at the bottom.
I missed that. Yeah, that we're just seeing it.
It didn't mention that in verse 38.
Top. Yeah.
There it is. They also taunted him.
But then it's just piled on here. Yeah, that we see over and over again.
So, but it wasn't just the ignorant masses, as it were, or the dying rebels. The Jewish religious leaders were joining in on the taunt, and their wording is kind of spine-chilling to me. He saved others. He cannot save himself. And that's such an ironic statement from the point of view of people of faith, because the fact is that we believe in Jesus precisely because he did not save himself, because his goal was to save others. Wow. That's what we believe, and they are just totally oblivious to that dynamic of Jesus' self-sacrifice.
They can't get that part. Wow. Yeah.
And then they also said, he's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. That one also just tingles my spine, because I almost want to believe them, that they would have believed in Jesus if he had done that one act of power in defiance of Roman authority and just extricated himself from the cross in some miraculous way and said, you can't touch this, you have no power over me. And they would have loved that, because what they want is to overthrow Rome, see, or to thumb their nose at Rome.
Yeah.
But so the irony is that they claim, and maybe truthfully, that they would have believed in Jesus if he had come down from the cross. And we, who are people of faith, believe in Jesus precisely because he did not come down from the cross, but instead sacrificed himself. At any rate, this is fascinating.
Yeah. We continue to see how Jesus comes in a different way than anyone expected him to. So then we go on to verses 45 through 56, and this is the death of Jesus, and a lot of confusing things, I would say, happen here. First, why don't you tell us a little bit of the timing? I think that helps us understand just a little bit of the context.
Matthew, in verse 45, mentions the noon hour and then says that he died at 3 p.m. So he mentions the last 3 hours on the cross.
Okay.
The other Gospels make it clear that Jesus was affixed to the cross at 9 a.m. So he was a total of 6 hours on the cross. Matthew takes it up in the middle of that when the darkness fell.
Okay.
For whatever reason, I don't know. Even that 6 hours, which sounds horrendously long to us, was a surprisingly short period of time for death to follow crucifixion.
Okay.
Many people hung on the cross for days. And that's because death by crucifixion did not occur through rapid blood loss. It usually occurred as a result of dehydration or asphyxia, inability to breathe. And that took a long time to develop. So at any rate, that's the timing issue.
Yeah.
Not that that's the big deal, but yeah.
And then we see Jesus speaks and cries out with a loud voice words that mean, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And these are words that are talked about and quoted a lot, and that we've talked about some of how misunderstood they seem to be. I've seen a lot of writings that say, actually, it's not that he's saying God's forsaken him, it's that he's quoting the beginning of Psalm 22, and that often the way they would quote a whole psalm wouldn't be to say the entire thing. It's almost like he's saying the title of the psalm, the name of the psalm, and that if you go into your reading plan this week, it is to read Psalm 22. I hope all of you will do that, because it's a beautiful psalm that ends not with him feeling like God has forsaken him, but rather with seeing the work of God in his life. So would you, is there anything you have to add to
you
that?
are right on target there. You cannot understand, I think, the crucifixion of Jesus from its spiritual perspective, from God's perspective, without understanding Psalm 22. We've already seen it with the casting of lots, right? The dice. And I forgot to mention that one of the things that the Jewish religious leaders are crying out is, he trusts in God, let God deliver him. That's another quote from Psalm 22. So it's all over this passage. And as you pointed out, my God, why have you forsaken me, is the first line of that great messianic psalm. And here's what's so important about reading the crucifixion story in the light of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is a lament psalm, which I know to our ears makes it sound like it's just bemoaning terrible developments. But that's not what a Jewish lament was. A Hebrew lament was stating what was causing turmoil or distress in our lives, and then expressing absolute confidence and trust in God. Every lament was like that. It had both. It was the lament is the most honest form of poetry or music ever written, because it admits to the human condition of suffering, and then expresses absolute trust in God in spite of that. So that's what Jesus is doing.
Wow, he's trusting in God.
Yes, and I think you're right. All of the people listening there that day, except the Roman soldiers, knew that psalm. It was a very famous messianic psalm. And so when they heard that first line, all these other things began echoing. Oh, casting of dice for his divided clothing? Yeah, that's in Psalm 22. Wait, that just happened. He trusts in God, let God deliver him. Wait, that's a line from that. My God, why have you forsaken me? Oh, yeah, right. Jesus is quoting a psalm of trust. And so that corrects, I think, a mistaken notion that many Christians have even about what was in Jesus' mind when he said those words, as if Jesus truly felt, and more than that, not just that Jesus truly felt that God had abandoned him, but many Christians believe and teach that God had truly abandoned him at that moment. And I've heard people say God can't look upon sin. And maybe I'm missing something, but in my reading of Scripture, I think that is just the opposite is the case. God always stares sin right in the face. God is not put off.
God meets us in sin even.
Exactly. And there's no time greater to illustrate that than the cross itself, where God is facing human sin.
Wow.
Yeah. So the ancient Jews misunderstood. They thought he was calling on Eli. I mean,
Elijah.
Thank you. Not Eli. Elijah. They thought he was calling on Elijah. So they misunderstood. I think, unfortunately, many Christians even today misunderstand too, and miss the point of the very, very powerful statement of trust that Jesus was making from the cross.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know. I think that's so important to understand that it really changes the cross, I think, if you can understand what Jesus was communicating in those moments. There's also a lot of weird things, I'll just call it weird things that happen in this time, that we see everything from the curtain torn in two, there's an earthquake and open tombs, all sorts of things going on there. Anything you want to add about those, or do we just see those as kind of mysteries?
Yeah, I can't explain the ripping of the curtain, but it does resonate with the all the way back to the baptism of Jesus, where it says that the heavens were split, so from above to below, and then God speaks through that. And this curtain, we know from the writings of Josephus, looked like the night sky. It was a deep blue, purplish blue in color, and had embroidered stars on it. So when that curtain split, it was like, once again, the splitting of the heavens with God's presence. So I can't read that without reflecting back on the amazing event of the baptism. And so at the beginning of Matthew and the end of Matthew, we've got God showing up.
In amazing ways.
Yeah. Now, you also asked about the tombs.
Any of the weird stuff that, the tomb, the earthquake,
I can handle that very quickly. I don't know what that's about.
It's okay.
I don't understand that, or exactly how it happened, or why, or anything like that. So,
and I don't believe we see this in any of the other gospel stories. So I just find that interesting that those are details that Matthew chose to record. So we can't know everything.
I can't explain that one.
Then we do see, though, the centurion saw and calls Jesus the Son of God. So that feels important.
Yeah, it feels important, and it is important right from the start. The first people that Matthew tells us visited the toddler Jesus were Gentiles. They came to worship him. Yeah. They got it. And then we see Jesus and interacting with another centurion who came to him and said, "My slave is sick." And Jesus says, "I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel." And now at the moment of his sacrificial death, we see another Roman centurion, Gentile, involved, who I don't know how much he understood about Jesus, but he does definitely say the right words, doesn't he? Yeah. Truly, this is the Son of God. And that would have been a big thing for a Roman centurion to say, because they worshipped the emperor as the Son of God. And so for him to say that about a criminal hanging on a Roman cross is just a huge development.
Yeah, that's astounding.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it is a big deal. And it fits right in with Matthew's understanding that God's kingdom is for all people and that Jesus has come to welcome Gentiles as well as Jews.
Yeah. We see this happening right while he's on the cross. Yeah. And then finally, we see that there are women around, and that it's interesting to see that there are only women disciples here at this moment, that we're not seeing the male disciples there.
In the other Gospels, there's some hint that some of the male disciples are at least in the vicinity, but Matthew only mentions 3 women. They all happen to be named Mary, which was the most popular women's name of the day. Mary is a form of Miriam, Moses' sister. Okay. So very, very popular. Not surprising that all these 3 women had Mary for the name. Mary Magdalene, most prominent among them. Yeah.
And then finally, we come to verses 57 through 66. And this is where Jesus is buried, that we see that there's a man named Joseph from Arimathea who we haven't heard of yet at this point. It's clear that he is rich. I mean, it says he's rich, but also that he even has a tomb to give, perhaps. Does that indicate wealth at all? Or?
Yeah, that he had a carved out tomb out of solid rock, I think indicates that he's a wealthy head of a family or something like that. And Matthew does identify him as a disciple. So he's a follower. However secret, we don't know, but he is a follower.
Open enough to bury him in his tomb.
Yeah, open enough to go directly to Pilate and ask for the body. So, we know that little bit about Joseph. There's even some doubt about where the town of Arimathea was. That's not certain. But what he did is clear. And the burial of Jesus is described in very clear terms. What I think is important here is that those women who were at the crucifixion were with his body as it was transferred to the tomb and saw where he was buried, so that when they went back the next morning, they knew where he was. There's no possibility that the women went to the wrong tomb and got confused about the resurrection. We'll talk about that a little more.
And that's an important detail.
Yeah, next time. But so not only their faithfulness, but what do police call that when a chain of evidence or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So there was no time when that body was out of sight. The women couldn't have made a mistake, I don't think.
Yeah.
And the other thing that Jews love to say was that Jesus' body was stolen by his followers, and then they pretended like there was a resurrection. There's very little chance of that because we're told about the stone being rolled across the doorway and that armed guards were set to the tomb.
Yeah, that they were supposed to make it as secure as possible.
Right.
Yeah, that feels all the more so.
Right.
How could it possibly go missing in that case?
So I think Matthew is setting us up to really trust the truthfulness of the story of the resurrection, which we'll talk about next time.
Well, as we wrap up then, I know it's a very long chapter, a lot here, but honestly, I feel like one of the most crucial chapters and stories of our faith. So it makes sense that we need to really take the time for this. Any themes or lessons that jump out to you as we wrap it up?
Well, let me just say this. The first question that was asked about Jesus was, where is he who was born King of the Jews? And King of the Jews is what was hanging around his neck or over his head as he died for our sins. And Matthew has brought us full circle. The King has come. The King has died. The King is on the move. He's on the rise. But we'll have to wait till next time.
We'll see that next week. Yeah. Well, and I think, my concluding thought would mostly be from that this is the kind of King we worship. One that does submit himself to the cross and that shows his power in that way. I know that's a theme we keep coming back to, but that's something that as we've really looked at some very gory details today, some really hard things, and that's what we kind of hold together, the goriness and hardship, the humility that he faced and the suffering, mockery, and that's the picture of a king who we worship and who we go to in time of need, who we see that is the savior of the world. And there's something there that will continue to unpack as we come back next week. Join us next week as we finish up the book of Matthew with chapter 28.